There was an idea called Marvel Games. The idea was to bring together various developers and see if they could create something more. See if they could work to bring corners of the Marvel Universe to life in ways publisher exclusivity deals and license tie-ins never could. It was an ambitious idea, and one distinct from the Marvel Cinematic Universe blueprint laid out on the film side. But since Marvel Games' rebranded focus in 2016, coming in the wake of major changes to Disney's overall approach to gaming and the recent end of some Marvel exclusivity contracts, the home of Spider-Man, the X-Men, and so many more has hoped to create a new era of superhero games. The goal wasn't to weave an interconnected story like the MCU, or ensure every Marvel show, movie, and comic event had a tie-in game to capture the zeitgeist. Instead, it was about marrying ideas and properties with developers interested in telling specific characters' stories. And while not every gamble has been a success, it's created an era of immense interest in each new Marvel game that hasn't existed for a long time. With so many on the horizon, including Guardians of the Galaxy this week, Midnight Suns, Spider-Man 2, and Wolverine, we thought it was a great time to check in on Marvel Games' recent approach, what's worked, what hasn't, and how it's led to an unpredictable, exciting future for Marvel superhero games. This is the story of Marvel Games so far. Marvel Games, with a lowercase g, have been produced for decades. The early 2000s saw a smattering of Marvel-related gaming successes like Hulk Ultimate Destruction, X-Men Legends, Marvel Ultimate Alliance, and Spider-Man 2. But just as Marvel Studios was rising and quickly establishing a brand of storytelling that would define a new generation of blockbusters for years to come, Marvel Games didn't have the same cohesive vision. In fact, it was a brand that was quickly established and then fell under the larger Disney Interactive Studios umbrella when Disney bought Marvel in 2009. A bunch of Marvel games continued to be released in the ensuing years, but the goodwill of those pre-Marvel games and Disney buyout releases quickly soured, as extended exclusive licensing agreements kept certain Marvel heroes locked to particular publishers. The MCU-adjacent video game era was marked more often than not by disappointing movie tie-ins like Sega's string of Iron Man, Thor, and Captain America, notable original misfires like X-Men Destiny, several Spider-Man games that couldn't quite capture players' attention like Spider-Man 2 did, and a focus on mobile games. Fun, if imperfect, games like Wolverine and Deadpool were, well, fun, but didn't quite reach the heights that players felt they could. Marvel games just weren't living up to the much more successful film counterparts. It's also worth quickly acknowledging that throughout Marvel Games' existence, mobile games have remained an integral part of the company's output. Contest of Champions, Future Fight, Strike Force, and most recently Future Revolution are among the many Marvel mobile games that have taken advantage of genre trends, offered free-to-play and gacha mechanics, and presumably have been important money earners. They're almost all crossover games that bring every corner of the Marvel Comics universe together, and while some of them have some genuine merits to discuss, they aren't quite our focus here, as Marvel Games has sought to rehabilitate the image of what its console and PC releases could be like. Disney's whole approach to video games changed during this era, and it would be all for the better for Marvel. In 2016, Disney not only shuttered one of its most ambitious gaming projects, the Toys to Life project Disney Infinity, but also announced it would be getting out of the self-publishing game when it came to console and PC releases. Quote, "After a thorough evaluation, we have modified our approach to console gaming and will transition exclusively to a licensing model. This shift in strategy means we will cease production of Disney Infinity, where the lack of growth in the Toys to Life market, coupled with high development costs, has created a challenging business model." Disney said all of this in an official statement at the time, and a report from insiders shortly after laid out the troubled history of Disney's video game arm, the lack of true investment to grow in the space, and a string of studio openings or acquisitions and, sadly, inevitable closures. Disney holds the keys to many of the biggest entertainment properties in the world, yet it couldn't figure out how to make a dent in gaming the way it did in movies and TV. Luckily, the minds behind Marvel Games had a plan. Marvel Games would forge ahead and do what Disney couldn't. It wouldn't lock characters into an exclusive oblivion, especially because exclusivity contracts that had previously existed had either been ended or dissolved early. It wouldn't suddenly try to amass a bunch of internal studios to create its own games in-house, and it wouldn't follow the Marvel Studios model and try to tell one massive, interconnected story. Instead, Marvel Games would lean into the licensing idea that Disney proper was leveraging, and work with various partners, regardless of past companies' experience with Marvel Games, to produce new games and series that the developers were interested in making. The new mission statement is what's behind the ups and downs of Marvel Games' last few years, and the fascinating potential still ahead of it. The closure of Disney's internal game development team focus forced the Mickey mothership and its various divisions to look for new talent. While Lucasfilm was already married to EA for console and PC Star Wars games, Marvel had no existing partnership that demanded it stick to one publisher and their teams. Instead, Marvel could pick and choose its partners, and it did so in rapid succession. Within a year of that big Disney closure, Marvel Games announced an original Spider-Man game from then independent Insomniac, a return to its fighting game partners Capcom for Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite, an episodic Guardians of the Galaxy series from Telltale, and a multi-game partnership with Square Enix that would begin with something, at the time, only known as the Avengers Project. In 2017, Marvel announced an end to its relationship with Gazillion, the studio behind the long-running MMO Marvel Heroes. This was to be a clean break from the past, and Heroes was one of the biggest casualties along the way. But these 4 new games span different publisher and developer agreements, Marvel characters, game genres, and platforms. And that was something very intentional for Marvel Games' future pursuits, as its creative director Bill Roseman told IGN in early 2017. Quote, "We want to give our partners freedom to look at all of our Marvel history and to pick from what interests them," Roseman told us then. He continued, quote, "It's a bit like we're saying, hey, you're the chef, you're going to make this meal. Here's all of the ingredients. You pick the ingredients that you like and make a new meal." And so here we were with a swath of games unrelated to each other that let teams with very specific talents dip into the Marvel IP they wanted to work with on their terms. Roseman told us then, quote, "We want all of our games to tell an original, all-new story. We want our development partners to have passion, we want them to put their stamp on the games. It's their game, we want it to be their vision." At the time, Roseman also referred to Marvel Games' intention of giving these developers the space they needed and the support to fulfill their creative visions, free from the pressure of an impending MCU release date. And Marvel did seem to make good on that promise of not rushing games to meet the MCU's plans. Marvel's Spider-Man came out in 2018, over a year after Spider-Man Homecoming. And the Avengers Project, which would become Marvel's Avengers, wouldn't see the light of day until 2019, and wasn't released until September 2020. The first wave of games in this new era were also integral lessons that would inform Marvel Games' approach moving forward. MVC Infinite, for example, demonstrated that even a Marvel game with a solid gameplay base could miss the mark. While The Fighter was, overall, praised for revitalizing the franchise with solid fighting mechanics and willingness to tweak elements of the genre, it was largely derided for poor presentation and interpretation of the characters that some, like IGN's own review, called, quote, "distractingly bad and stiff." It was also dinged heavily for a lacking roster, one that omitted beloved X-Men and Fantastic Four characters. Many speculated at the time that this was a byproduct of 20th Century Fox still owning the movie rights to those franchises, which of course is no longer an issue. Telltale's Guardians also debuted in 2017, and while some of the lessons learned from it are mired in the messy closure of Telltale, another game in this first wave solidified the first real win for the new Marvel games. Marvel's Spider-Man, Insomniac's 2018 open-world hit, set the stage for what would follow. A specific, clear vision of a beloved character, different enough from live-action, animated, and comic book counterparts, coupled with rock-solid gameplay and design, led to Marvel's biggest hit in this era. Spider-Man has gone on to become the best-selling superhero game of all time in North America, one of the PS4's most successful exclusives, and the start of a wider ongoing franchise. There were games before it that didn't quite land, and some after that similarly didn't set the world on fire, but Spider-Man was Marvel Games' Iron Man. It was the first distillation of success this rebrand had been chasing. Insomniac could carve out their own Marvel universe and deliver on the power fantasy of one of the brand's most beloved superheroes. And its success didn't preclude Spider-Man from showing up in other games of different genres before or after. True to its mission statement, Marvel Games still experimented with different genres in this first wave of games to some mixed results. 2018 saw a dip into the VR space with Marvel Powers United VR that largely came and went, while 2019 included the launch of Marvel Ultimate Alliance 3: The Black Order, which proved that Marvel games dipping back into the franchises that did work pre-2016 could work again. The Nintendo Switch exclusive brought together a host of Marvel characters, including Spidey, but not Insomniac's Peter Parker, and revived the team-based dungeon crawler franchise to generally positive acclaim and over 1 million copies sold by the end of that year. The Black Order could be seen more as a safer bet, but considering Marvel Games was still in its early days, safe bets were smart bets. And unexpected, maybe even risky bets can be just as fascinating. Pivoting off the PlayStation and Marvel relationship that succeeded with Spider-Man, the console maker secured another platform exclusive featuring one of present-day Marvel's biggest names. Marvel's Iron Man VR was released in 2020, and though it was held back by aging VR technology and a somewhat repetitive campaign, the wish fulfillment of flying as Iron Man was very much there. It might have just hit a few years too early, given that next-gen PSVR tech in the works could help alleviate some of its setbacks. Iron Man VR was overshadowed perhaps by Marvel Games' most troubled reveal and launch yet. After years of silence, Marvel's Avengers debuted at E3 2019 to, quite simply, confusion. The nearly identical lineup to the MCU's first Avengers roster, the realistic but not quite one-to-one approximation of the characters to their live-action counterparts, and mixed messaging about what kind of game Avengers would be, overshadowed what was meant to be an exciting reveal years in the making. A more thorough understanding of what Avengers actually was came in the months that followed, but that lucidity wasn't necessarily met with increased enthusiasm. It instead brought to a head perhaps both the best and worst of what players were hoping for in this new era of Marvel games. On the one hand, you had a relatively well-received campaign, featuring a story that put Marvel's first comic headlining Muslim character, Kamala Khan, at the heart of it. And though no easy task, developer Crystal Dynamics largely created a combat system that smartly approached each character's power set. Thor can soar through the skies while throwing Mjolnir around like Kratos' Leviathan axe, Hulk's weighty moveset complemented the not-so-jolly Green Giant's penchant for destruction, and clear inspiration from Crystal's Tomb Raider work allowed even human characters like Black Widow to shine. But those power sets were neutered by the requirement to make each character similar enough so that hopping between them wouldn't be a nightmare for the player. And Avengers' notorious approach to its post-game and post-launch content has bogged it down even as Crystal Dynamics continues to support it with new content and patches. As many players and critics have noted before, two of Avengers' greatest sins were a loot system that makes no meaningful cosmetic change to the character, resulting in items to find that are largely meaningless other than the stats they provide, and a lack of varied endgame content. It was and continues to be a confusing rollout, if only because the potential seems so clear to so many players. Crystal has added some pretty cool new heroes since launch, and recently introduced its most expansive update yet with the very impressive introduction of Black Panther and Wakanda. More additions, like Spider-Man for PlayStation players, are promised to be on the way, and the game's recent addition to Xbox Game Pass could bring more players into the fray. But for every good new addition or fix, there can be a frustrating misstep, like the recent addition of Pay for XP boosts, when the developers had promised real money options would only ever be cosmetic. What becomes of Avengers in the long run remains a question, as does how long support for it will last, but it could dramatically affect future game plans. Though the learnings from it may not be noticeable in the short term, as Marvel's upcoming slate of games is already announced and seems to be learning largely from the success of the Spider-Man franchise. The next Marvel Games release is set to be Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy, the second in Marvel Square Enix partnership. Another shot at the team of selfish but ultimately caring heroes comes from the Deus Ex devs Eidos Montreal, and in what feels like direct opposition to Square's other Marvel release, Guardians is a single-player only story-driven game, and was heavily marketed as such during its introduction only a few months ago. While that might seem strange for a team-based property, it allowed the devs to focus on applying combat ideas and mechanics to a single character, while finding inventive other ways to bring Gamora, Drax, Groot, and Rocket into the fold alongside Star-Lord. Following that is Marvel's Midnight Suns in early 2022. Inspired by a beloved comic run from the 90s, it pairs Marvel with Firaxis, a studio that's become the dominant force in its primary genre. Also learning from Avengers, Midnight Suns had a bit of an odd reveal, as its promise of a new card-based system worried those who love the systems the studio has developed in the XCOM series. To get ahead of that though, Marvel already released some in-depth gameplay footage to demonstrate not only how the card system plays out, but how Firaxis is aiming for a Marvel vibe that is distinct from the MCU or any of Marvel's other upcoming games. And then, to the surprise of no one who's played Insomniac's Spider-Man games, a sequel putting Peter and Miles together is set for a 2023 release, introducing Venom and perhaps some other villains into a universe brimming with character-focused cliffhangers to resolve from the last two games. But the success and continued development relationship with Insomniac has led to one of Marvel Games' biggest surprises yet, a Wolverine game from the same developer. Little is known about it other than the team's ambitions to make a mature, story-driven experience. And while its reveal was surprising, what Marvel Games is aiming for quickly makes the decision seem like a no-brainer. And as a concept, it perfectly gels with this next phase of Marvel Games' evolution. Not every hero can be a headliner, but in an era where Marvel now has the rights to the X-Men back for film and TV, and the lack of the team's presence in games was so significant at the start of Marvel Games' run, having Wolverine not only headline his own game, but also appear in Midnight Suns shows the renewed focus on a major corner of the Marvel Universe. Again, it's not, as far as we know, tied to any upcoming game or movie, but allows the games division to capitalize on the larger interest in the character and series while carving out its own take on Logan. These surely aren't the only Marvel games percolating throughout the industry, and it's interesting to be at a point where Marvel again has 4 games to showcase just as it did during its earliest days. These 4 have all the lessons of what came before to build upon, while continuing to reinforce the ideals Marvel Games has aimed for since its debut, letting a wide swath of developers take on various different heroes in several genres that play to those studios' strengths. We'll quickly learn which games of this new wave do and don't work, and how they've been informed by the adventures before them. But there's potential for each to offer its own distinct take on Marvel heroes, and perhaps be another Spider-Man in Marvel Games' pantheon. Though, maybe now that we're in Phase 2, it's more apropos to say we're looking for Marvel Games' Winter Soldier. But for how easy it is to try and make comparisons to the immensely successful MCU, Marvel Games' approach is far different. Each game release may not build on the last one's story, but even in just its upcoming batch, Marvel Games is clearly learning from and building upon the successes and stumbles of its past. It's created a potential future that is far more uncertain, but no less exciting in the sheer potential of what may lie ahead. The story of Marvel Games is just beginning. And like with any superhero saga, what comes after the origin story has the chance to be something super. For more on Marvel Games, be sure to check out our review of Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy and our deep dive into the latest Spider-Man 2 trailer. And for everything else in the world of Marvel games, movies, shows, comics, toys, and that Wolverine fanfic I wrote when I was 12, stay tuned to IGN.